A lone survivor on an alien world hears a voice that shouldn't exist. My mother died today. Can I spend the day with you, human? Why the words hang in the air, challenging everything he knows about survival and the Prime Directive. What happens when compassion clashes with interstellar law? Kyle rose before the twin suns crested the jagged peaks. His movements followed a pattern worn smooth by repetition. He checked the perimeter sensors first, then the water reclaimer. Every action served survival. He had learned the cost of deviation through hunger, through injury, through nights spent shivering in the acidic rain. The silence of the planet Kia was a heavy thing, broken only by the wind through crystalline leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. His shelter was a hybrid of crashed ship parts and local materials, organized with military precision. No space was wasted on sentiment. Rations were stacked by caloric value. Tools hung in order of frequency of use. The only personal item was the faded Earth Science Division tattoo on his shoulder, a reminder of a life that felt like someone else's memory. The landscape beyond his camp was a study in contradictions. Towering lavender trees with bioluminescent fungi cast deep shadows where predators could wait. The air smelled of ozone and damp earth. It was beautiful in a way that demanded constant respect. A misstep could mean a broken leg from a hidden crevice or a toxic reaction from brushing against the wrong plant. He moved through his tasks with an economy of motion that spoke of hard lessons. His hands, scarred and calloused, never fumbled. He had conditioned himself to view everything through the lens of utility. A plant was either edible, medicinal, or a threat. A sound was either background noise or a warning. Research into long-term isolation suggests the mind sheds social layers, focusing only on immediate needs. Kyle's world had shrunk to the next meal, the next sunrise, the next potential threat. Companionship was a luxury his reality could not afford. The mental load of constant vigilance was his true burden. His camp's layout confirmed this singular focus. 2 stools, 1 plate, 1 cup. The bed was a simple cot. There were no extra portions prepared, no second set of tools laid out. The silence was his most reliable indicator of safety. Any break in it required immediate identification and assessment. It was a tense peace maintained through unending watchfulness. He had accepted this as his permanent existence, a cycle of procurement and defense against the planet's indifference. This meticulous, solitary rhythm was about to be broken. A sound filtered through the forest that didn't belong. It wasn't the skittering of a rock grubber or the low hum of the wind. It was soft, deliberate. The sound of movement where no movement should be. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to the worn grip of his plasma cutter. His entire body tightened, every sense straining to classify the new variable. The familiar silence, his constant and threatening companion, had been breached by something unknown. The sound was wrong. Not an animal's cry or a branch breaking in the wind. It was lighter. A rustle of leaves that spoke of careful, deliberate movement. Kyle's body went tight. His hand found the grip of his plasma cutter. He dropped into a low crouch, his eyes scanning the dense foliage where the sound originated. Every instinct honed over 5 years of near-constant threat assessment screamed at him to identify and neutralize. To treat this as he would any other predator probing his defenses. Yet the quality of the sound gave him pause. It lacked the practiced stealth of a hunting creature. There was a clumsiness to it. A faint shuddering breath that suggested fear, not aggression. It was the sound of something trying to be quiet and failing. His training provided a clear, cold directive. Observe from concealment. Do not engage. The planetary surveys were definitive. This sector was designated non-sentient. The indigenous life forms were animalistic, driven by base instinct. Nothing that could make a sound like that should exist here. Then a voice cut through the air. Small and thin, it was scratched raw with emotion. It spoke words he had not heard in half a decade. Words from another world. Hello? The language was English. His mind stuttered, unable to process the impossibility. He saw a shift in the shadows between 2 broad-leafed ferns. A small figure, no taller than his waist, was half hidden there. His grip tightened on his weapon. His mind raced through a frantic list of possibilities. A hallucination born of isolation. A trap set by some unknown intelligent predator. A recording from his own crashed ship somehow activated. None of the explanations fit. None of them felt right. Every protocol in the Earth Science Division manual demanded he stay hidden. The prime directive was clear: no contact. Observe and report. To interfere was to risk cultural contamination on a scale that could not be undone. The rules were his armor, the only thing that separated his actions from chaos. He held his position, his breathing shallow. He was a soldier. He followed orders even when they were his own. But then the voice came again, and this time it carried a weight that shattered his resolve. It was a child's voice, woven through with a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow. It bypassed the soldier and spoke directly to the man. The figure took a hesitant step forward, emerging from the veil of leaves into a sliver of light filtering down from the canopy. The sight made his breath catch. The creature was bipedal, humanoid in shape with large dark eyes that dominated a small face. Its skin was a pale, dusty blue, and it was shivering. Those eyes, wide and desperate, held his. They were not the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of someone utterly lost. This was no animal. This was a child, and it was afraid. She stood completely exposed, making no move to defend herself. Her posture was one of pure exhaustion, a deep weariness that seemed to bow her small shoulders. The child looked up at him, her large dark eyes holding his. She spoke again, the words shaped with a soft, lilting accent that flattened some vowels and stretched others. It was English, but not as he knew it. It sounded old, different. Her words were simple. They carried a weight that struck him in the chest. My mother died today. There was no elaboration, no story. It was a raw statement of fact, delivered with a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. The grief in her voice was a universal language, one that bypassed all cultural and species barriers. It was the sound of a profound and sudden emptiness. Kyle knew that sound. He had heard it in his own voice years ago, in the static-filled seconds after learning his ship was gone. She took another small, hesitant step forward. Her gaze was fixed on him, assessing but not fearful. Can I spend the day with you, human? The question was so direct it was disarming. She acknowledged what he was, naming his otherness without malice or reverence. It was a simple request for temporary shelter from a storm of loss. She was not asking for a rescue. She was asking for a single day of not being alone. Inside his mind, his training responded like a klaxon. Protocols flashed behind his eyes in bright warning red. Contamination risk. Cultural pollution. Unknown biological agents. The prime directive existed for a reason. This was the exact scenario it was designed to prevent. One moment of misplaced compassion could unravel a civilization. It could introduce ideas, technologies, or diseases that would destroy the natural development of an entire species. The rules were clear, logical, and absolute. They were his anchor in a chaotic universe. To break them was unthinkable. But the soldier staring down the protocols saw only a child covered in a fine layer of forest dust, her blue skin smudged with dirt and what might have been dried tears. She had just lost the only person in her world. He knew what that kind of loss felt like. He knew the crushing silence that followed. His own isolation, once a matter of survival, now felt like a prison he had built for himself. The regulation was a wall. Her need was a key. The conflict lasted only a second. The calculation was not one of rules, but of basic humanity. The directive was designed to protect the abstract concept of a culture. It said nothing about a single shivering child standing in the light. His response did not come from the soldier. It came from the man who had been alone for 5 years. It came from a place deeper than training, older than any interstellar law. The words left his mouth before he could stop them, quiet but firm. You can stay forever. It was a promise. It was a violation of every rule he had ever lived by, and it was the only thing that felt true. The forests of Kia held many predators, but only one truly owned the territory. They were called dagger teeth. They were not merely animals. They were perfect killing engines shaped by a harsh world. Lean and muscular, their bodies moved with a fluid grace that belied their size. Their name came from the twin rows of serrated, foot-long fangs that could snap bone. Their hides were a mottled gray-green, perfect camouflage against the lichen-covered trees and rocky outcrops. They hunted in coordinated packs, their tactics more akin to a special forces unit than a wild animal pack. A single dagger tooth was a lethal threat. A pack was an unstoppable force. Their 6-legged design gave them a disturbing advantage. The extra set of limbs provided incredible stability and allowed for bursts of speed in any direction. They could pivot on a single point, change direction mid-lunge, or scramble up a near-vertical surface without breaking stride. This made their attack patterns chaotic, unpredictable. You couldn't anticipate a charge. They came from angles that made no logical sense to a bipedal mind. Their claws were their other main weapon. Retractable and black as obsidian, they could extend to a length that could shred the composite plating of Kyle's crashed shuttle. He had seen the deep parallel grooves they left in trees and rock. They were not just for killing. They were for climbing, for digging, for tearing anything apart. What separated them from mere beasts was their intelligence. They learned. They remembered. Kyle had scars on his back from their claws from their first encounter. They had watched him. They had studied his patrol routes. They set an ambush using one of their own as bait, feigning injury. It was a level of tactical thinking he had never encountered in a non-sentient species. They communicated with low-frequency clicks and chitters, coordinating their movements to flank and envelop their prey. They understood terrain, using high ground and dense foliage to their advantage. They were more than dangerous. They were cunning. Kyle's history with them was written on his body and in his heightened alertness. Every foray into the deep forest was a calculated risk. He had learned to read the signs of their presence. Scat filled with indigestible bone fragments, distinctive three-clawed prints in soft earth, the sudden utter silence of the forest birds, a sure sign a pack was on the move. His previous encounters had been desperate, close-run things. He had survived through firepower and retreat, never through dominance. Leah's knowledge became their greatest asset. She understood them on an instinctual level. She knew their hunting cycles, linked to the phases of Kia's larger moon. She could identify their preferred denning areas, rocky outcrops facing the morning sun. She knew which animals they preferred to hunt and thus where they were likely to be. Her mother had taught her to listen for the specific click pattern of a hunting pack on the move, a sound distinct from their casual communication. This was not theoretical knowledge. It was the survival lore of someone who had lived her entire life under their shadow. The forest itself was their true hunting ground, and survival meant turning that fact against them. It wasn't about standing and fighting in the open. That was a death wish. It was about using the environment. Narrow passages between rocks that limited their numbers, thick, thorny brush that their larger bodies couldn't penetrate, high ground that negated their climbing advantage, waterways they were reluctant to cross. The fight was never against the creatures alone. It was against the terrain they controlled. To survive, you had to be smarter than the pack. You had to think like the forest. You had to use its walls and channels and hazards as your weapons because facing a dagger-tooth directly was a fight you would only win once. The air was still. They were in a gully, a place Leah knew for the moss that grew on its shaded northern rocks. It was a routine gathering trip. Kyle kept watch, his rifle slung but ready, his eyes scanning the tree line above them. Leah worked quickly, her small fingers deftly scraping the green-gray moss into a pouch. The silence felt heavy. It was the wrong kind of silence. The birds had stopped. Movement flickered in his peripheral vision. A shift of shadow among the dense ferns crowding the gully's edge. It was too fast. A gray-green blur launched from the foliage. The first dagger-tooth. It moved with shocking speed, covering the ground in 2 bounds. Its 6 legs were a coordinated mechanism of muscle and intent. Kyle's rifle came up. The shot was instinct. The plasma bolt caught the creature in the shoulder. It screamed, a high-pitched shriek of rage and pain, but it didn't go down. The hit only spun it, its momentum carrying it forward. The smell of seared flesh and ozone filled the air. Leah's voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. The big one on the ridge. He directs them. She wasn't looking at the wounded beast. Her eyes were locked higher up. Kyle followed her gaze. A larger dagger-tooth stood on the gully's rim. It didn't charge. It watched. Its head moved in short, sharp motions, and answering clicks came from the surrounding forest. This was the Alpha. It was directing the hunt. Their retreat began. It wasn't a run. It was a fighting withdrawal. Kyle fired measured shots, not to kill, but to keep the circling beasts at bay. They moved backward, step by step, toward a narrower section of the gully Leah had pointed to. The wounded creature charged again, relentless. Kyle fired. Missed. A second beast lunged from the right. He pivoted, too slow. A black claw extended to its full length raked across his chest. It tore through his jacket and shirt like paper. The impact was brutal. It wasn't the cut itself, but the force behind it. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. He staggered back, his breath gone. The pain was a white-hot line across his ribs. He could feel the warm, sudden soak of blood spreading down his torso. His vision swam. Blood loss. He knew the signs. The lightheadedness. The cold sweat. It was a critical problem, immediate and debilitating. His grip on the rifle wavered. He expected Leah to run, to use the distraction to escape. She did not. As he fought to stay upright, she moved. She dropped her pouch of moss. She shoved against him, not away but toward the gully wall. "Here, sit." Her voice held no panic. It was all command. She positioned his faltering body into a seated position against a large rock, putting the solid stone at his back. She snatched the rifle from his weakening hands, propping it beside him. Then she was ripping his jacket open, her small hands pressing against the flowing wound. The child was gone. In her place was a field medic assessing damage. She was not a victim waiting for rescue. She was the only thing standing between him and a pack of predators. The roles had reversed in the space of a heartbeat. The caregiver was now the one who needed care, and the child became the protector. Her face was a mask of intense concentration, her large eyes scanning the wound, then the surrounding forest, then his pale face. She was working against two clocks, the one in his veins and the ones closing in around them. She watched him for a long moment, her dark eyes tracing the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders. They held a quiet assessment that felt far older than her small frame suggested. Then her gaze dropped. It landed on the faded black ink on his left shoulder, visible through a tear in his worn shirt. The stylized globe and orbiting satellite of the Earth Science Division. Her brow furrowed not in confusion but in concentration. She pointed one slender blue finger. "You are from the stars." Her voice was soft but certain. The statement landed with the force of a physical blow. Kyle's breath caught. He instinctively looked down at the tattoo, a mark he had long stopped seeing. It was a part of him, like a scar, a relic from a past life. It shouldn't mean anything here. It couldn't mean anything here. The tension in the air shifted. This was no longer just about a lost child. This was a breach of fundamental knowledge. She shouldn't recognize this symbol. It was impossible. The surveys were clear. No sentient life. No prior contact. The Prime Directive was built on that foundational assumption. Her knowing what it meant shattered that assumption completely. His mind, already reeling from her sudden appearance, now struggled with a deeper, more profound violation of reality. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice low. "My mother showed me pictures." The answer was simple, devastating. "She told me of the Sky People. Their marks. Their machines." She spoke of it as a lesson, a piece of her education. Her mother had knowledge she should not have possessed. Knowledge that could only come from previous undocumented contact. The tattoo on his arm was no longer just a personal memory. It was a symbol she had been taught to recognize. For him, it represented everything he had lost. Earth, his division, a life of order and purpose. It was a ghost on his skin. For her, it represented something else entirely. It was a signifier of the stories her mother told. Stories of beings from beyond the sky. To her, in this moment of utter loss, it wasn't a warning. It was a point of connection, a known quantity in a terrifyingly unknown situation. It was a symbol of hope, a possible source of salvation. That simple mark, etched into his skin years ago on another world, became a bridge between them. It was a shared point of reference in a universe that had left them both isolated. The first thin thread of trust formed around that symbol. He saw the recognition in her eyes, and it changed everything. This wasn't a first contact scenario. This was a consequence of one. The ethical calculation he had been wrestling with just moments before was now obsolete. The Prime Directive, the strict prohibition against interference, was already compromised. Someone else had been here before him. Someone had made contact. They had left behind knowledge. They had left behind this child. His mind raced through the implications. Her existence, her language, her recognition of his tattoo. It all pointed to a previous encounter. An encounter that had been hidden, unreported. The clean, clear lines of protocol were now hopelessly blurred. The directive was designed to prevent exactly this kind of cultural contamination, but the contamination had already happened. He wasn't introducing something new. He was stepping into a situation that was already irreversibly altered. The question was no longer whether to break the rules. The question was how to navigate the broken world someone else had left behind. The weight of his promise, "Young, you can stay forever," now carried a different, heavier meaning. He studied the child as she sat on a crate, her feet not touching the ground. In the clearer light of his camp, the details became more apparent. Her skin was a pale, dusty blue, like faded denim. He had seen the natives of Kia from a distance a handful of times. Their skin was a deep, vivid cobalt, nearly black in shadow. Hers was different. It was a shade too light. Her features held a subtle blend that didn't quite match the full-blooded Kians he had observed. The high cheekbones were there, but the set of her eyes was different. Her hair was fine and dark, but lacked the coarser texture he'd noted. She was a hybrid, a mix of two worlds. Her mixed heritage was the reason she stood before him now. It was the reason her mother was dead and she was alone. She explained it in simple, heartbreaking terms. The others did not like that I was different. My mother was different too after she knew my father. She spoke of exclusion not as a theory, but as a daily reality. Her mother had been cast out from her own community for her association with a human, for bearing his child. Their isolation was not a choice. It was a necessity for survival. They lived on the fringes, away from the main tribes, scavenging and hiding. They were outcasts in their own world. Her existence was proof. It was the final, undeniable piece of evidence. There had been a human here before him. A scout, perhaps. A corporate surveyor operating off the books. Someone who broke the most fundamental rule of deep space exploration. He didn't just interact with a native. He fathered a child. Then he left. He abandoned them to the consequences of his actions. Kyle felt a cold anger tighten in his chest. This was the ethical nightmare the Prime Directive was written to prevent. The child before him wasn't an abstract concept of cultural contamination. She was the living, breathing result of it. She represented a problem with no clean solution. A violation that had already rippled through two lives and would now ripple through his. Her story mirrored his own isolation, but in reverse. He was a human alone on an alien world, separated from his kind by circumstance and distance. She was part alien, rejected by her own kind for what she was. They were both alone, but their solitude came from opposite sides of the same fence. He was the outsider looking in. She was the insider cast out. They both understood the deep, hollow silence that comes from being separate. The constant vigilance, the knowledge that you don't belong anywhere. This shared understanding became the foundation of everything that followed. It was a bond stronger than species or language. It was the recognition of a similar wound. When he handed her a ration bar, she took it without suspicion. When she pointed to a plant he had marked as toxic and said good for fever, he listened. Their trust was not built on grand gestures. It was built on small, quiet acknowledgments of a shared reality. They were two exiles from different stars, finding a fragile common ground in the space between their two worlds. He saw his own loneliness reflected in her eyes, and she saw a chance for shelter in his. It was a pact made not with words, but with a mutual recognition of loss. The narrow crevice offered cold, hard safety. The dagger teeth's frustrated snarls echoed from the opening, a promise of what waited outside. In the dim light, Kyle's breathing was shallow. The pain in his chest was a dull, persistent throb held at bay by Leah's poultice. He turned his attention to her. His movements were slow, careful. He checked her arms, her legs, looking for any sign of injury from the frantic climb or the claw that had nearly taken his life. His concern was automatic. It was the act of a protector verifying the safety of the one in his care. She watched him. Her large, dark eyes held his, but the look in them had changed. The raw fear from the attack was gone. So was the simple gratitude she had shown before. This was something else. Something deeper and more settled. It was a look of profound recognition. He was not just a human who gave her shelter. He was the one who had fought for her, who had placed his body between her and the claws, who was now injured and in pain, making sure she was unharmed. She placed her small blue hand over his, stopping his inspection. Her touch was light but firm. She spoke, and her voice was quiet in the confined space, but it carried a weight that filled the crevice. "You checked me for hurt." It was a statement, not a question. He gave a single, slow nod. "It was what you did." She looked down at their hands, then back up at his face. Her next words were simple, clear, and they landed with the force of a physical truth. "That is what family does." The phrase hung in the air between them. It was not a sentimental claim. It was a definition. For her, it carried the memory of a lifetime defined by its absence. She had known only rejection from her own kind. Protection was a concept her mother had given her in stories, a theoretical idea she had never truly experienced from a group. Now she had. She had just been shown in the most direct terms possible what it meant to be shielded, to have someone value your safety above their own. For Kyle, the word struck a different chord. He had not had a family in 5 years. His existence had been a solitary loop of survival. Words like family belonged to the ghost of his old life. They were concepts that had no practical use on Kia. They were luxuries. But her statement reframed everything. Their bond was not a rescue anymore. It was not an obligation born of pity or a violation of a directive. Her words acknowledged a mutual commitment that had been tested and proven under fire. It was a choice made by both of them, to be there for each other. This was not about rules anymore. The prime directive dealt in abstracts, cultures, societies, the greater good. It had no language for this. It could not quantify the silent agreement in a rocky crevice. It could not measure the trust in a child's eyes or the protective instinct in a soldier's heart. Their connection existed in a space beyond regulations in species fen lay. It was a basic human and more than human impulse to protect and to belong. Some bonds simply transcend. They form in the crucible of shared survival. They are built on actions, not words, on choices made in the heat of the moment. He had chosen to stand between her and the claws. She had chosen to stay and fight with a paste of moss. Those were the decisions that defined them. The words she spoke were just the confirmation. They were a declaration that the rescue was over. A relationship had begun. It was a bond that would now face its greatest test, not from the predators outside, but from the world he had left behind. The hum of that world was already a distant rumor on the wind, a sound that would soon force a new set of choices. The camp changed. The transition was slow, a quiet evolution from shelter to home. It was no longer just a place to survive the night. It became a shared space built on mutual respect. The wreckage of Kyle's ship remained the heart of it, the twisted metal frame providing the core structure, but now it was woven through with Leah's touches. Dried medicinal herbs hung from the ceiling next to power conduits. A small bed of native grasses, soft and sweet-smelling, was pushed next to his cot. It was a fusion of two worlds, two ways of living. The hard lines of technology were softened by the organic presence of the forest. Their days fell into a rhythm of teaching. The lessons crossed deep cultural boundaries. Kyle taught her English, proper Earth standard, not the fragmented version passed down from her father. He corrected her accent on certain words, explained idioms, wrote the alphabet in the dirt. He showed her how to clean and aim his plasma rifle, how to track power usage from the ship's broken cells. These were skills of his world. They were lessons in his language, his tools. Leah was the better teacher. She taught him the forest. She showed him how to read the subtle color changes in a leaf to gauge its toxicity. She mapped the predator trails in the soft soil, explaining seasonal migration patterns he had only guessed at. She knew which fungi glowed brightest at night for light, and which ones could ferment into a weak antiseptic. Her knowledge was not written down. It was lived. It was passed from her mother's hands to hers and now to his. He learned to see the planet not as a hostile enemy, but as a complex system he could work with. His data pads held schematics. Her mind held the wisdom of a lifetime. Their routines became a seamless blend of both systems. Morning started with a check of the perimeter sensors, followed by a check of the weather by observing cloud patterns over the eastern ridge. Dinner might be a reheated ration pack, or a stew made from a root Leah had dug up, seasoned with a tangy purple flower. He provided the secure walls. She ensured the walls contained a life worth living inside. It was a partnership of necessity that grew into a partnership of choice. The turning point came during a hunt. A small deer-like creature had wandered near camp. Kyle raised his rifle. Leah put a hand on the barrel, lowering it. She took the hunting knife he had given her. She moved with a silence he could never achieve, using the wind and the terrain to get within a few feet. Her throw was clean and efficient. It was over quickly. She had provided meat using her method, not his. She was not a child needing protection on a hunt. She was a provider, a capable member of their team. The dynamic solidified completely after that. She was no longer just a student or a ward. She was an equal partner in their survival. They had become a complete unit. His technological prowess and military discipline combined with her indigenous knowledge, and intuitive understanding of the ecosystem created a resilience neither could have achieved alone. They covered each other's weaknesses and amplified each other's strengths. The man from Earth and the child of Kia were no longer just two beings sharing space. They were a team, a family, a self-contained system of survival built on 14 months of unspoken trust and shared hardship. They were ready for anything the planet could throw at them. They were not prepared for what came from the sky. Blood soaked through Kyle's shirt dark and fast. His vision blurred at the edges. Shock was setting in, a cold clamminess spreading under his skin. Leah's hands were on his chest, pressing hard. He expected her to reach for his medkit, for the advanced synth bandages and coagulant spray that represented the peak of Earth's field medicine. He trusted that technology. It was proven. It was his reality. Instead, her small fingers went to the pouch at her belt, the one filled with the moss they had just gathered. He watched, his mind struggling to process through the thickening fog of pain. She took a handful of the green-gray plant matter and crushed it between a flat stone and her palm. She mixed in a few drops of water from her canteen, working it into a thick, rough paste. It looked like mud. It looked primitive. To his fading logic, it was a pointless gesture. A child playing at being a healer. She smeared the paste directly into the wound. The effect was immediate and impossible. A cooling sensation radiated from the gash, cutting through the searing pain like a switch had been flipped. The cold sweats receded. The world snapped back into focus. The shock that had been pulling him under was countered by a profound, spreading numbness. It wasn't the deadening effect of a drug. It was a natural cessation of the nerve signals screaming in his chest. Then the bleeding stopped. It didn't slow. It stopped. The dark red flow that had been welling up around her fingers just ceased. The moss paste acted as a powerful coagulant, sealing the torn vessels with an efficiency that dwarfed his synth bandages. His high-tech solutions required pressure and time. They were a process. This was an instant result. He stared at the closed wound, now covered in the green poultice. There was no more blood. Only a dull, numb ache where moments before there had been blinding agony. This was not a random act. It was a practice procedure. Her movements were sure, economical. She had done this before. She was channeling knowledge passed directly from her mother. In that moment, her mother was not gone. Her wisdom lived on in her daughter's hands. The survival lessons of a lifetime spent on this hostile world were being applied to save a man from the stars. It was a complete transfer of indigenous knowledge, a lineage of practical skill. A fundamental shift occurred in Kyle's perception. His entire frame of reference built on technological superiority cracked. He had dismissed the native flora and fauna as threats or resources. He had never considered them as a sophisticated pharmacological library. His arrogance had blinded him. The planet wasn't just a challenge to overcome. It offered solutions if you knew how to look. Her simple poultice represented a depth of understanding he had completely overlooked. Their relationship pivoted on that moment. The dynamic of protector and dependent shattered. He was now reliant on her in the most basic way. His survival was literally in her hands. His tech had failed. Her knowledge had not. The roles were no longer clear. He was the adult, the soldier, the one with the weapon. She was the child, the native, the one with the moss. Yet in that gully she held all the power. She was the expert. He was the patient. The caregiver needed care, and the child provided it without hesitation. The line between them blurred into irrelevance. They were simply two beings, one helping the other. The hierarchy of their worlds meant nothing against the simple, urgent need to stop the bleeding. The gully ended in a sheer rock face. It was their only remaining option. The pack had them cornered. Two of the larger alphas led the advance, their six-legged stances low and ready. They moved in a coordinated crawl, herding them toward the dead end. The cliff was a mix of weathered stone and stubborn, thorny vines. For a man with a bleeding chest wound, climbing it seemed impossible. For a child, it was a death sentence. The dagger teeth knew it. Their clicks took on a new anticipatory rhythm. Leah's small hand gripped his arm. Not there, here. She pointed to a section of the cliff Kyle's eyes had dismissed. It looked smooth, featureless. To her, it was a map. A thin fissure ran vertically, almost invisible. A small outcrop provided a foothold just above their heads. A root from a clinging plant strong enough to bear weight was exposed a few feet up. Her knowledge wasn't just about plants and predators. It was about the very bones of the land. She saw handholds where he saw only a wall, He boosted her up first. Her lighter frame was an advantage now. She scrambled, finding tiny ledges and cracks his larger fingers and heavier body could never utilize. She moved with a nimble confidence, climbing halfway up the initial section before looking back. Your turn. Left hand on the gray rock, right foot on the vine knot. Her instructions were clear, direct. He followed, his injured chest screaming with every pull. The climb was an agony of strained muscle and tearing pain. His world narrowed to the next handhold she pointed out, the next instruction she gave. They moved in a desperate, coordinated dance. He would struggle to a ledge. She would lean down, her small hand finding his wrist, helping to steady his grip. He would brace, and she would use his shoulder as a step to reach a higher point he couldn't see. It was a partnership forged in absolute necessity. His strength supported her reach. Her vision guided his strength. The dagger teeth did not give up. They followed. Their six-legged agility made them terrifying climbers. Their sharp claws found purchase on the same minute imperfections Leah had pointed out. They scrabbled upward, their heavy bodies moving with a disturbing spider-like grace. They were slower than on flat ground, but relentless. A claw swiped inches from Kyle's boot. The sound of scratching claws on stone was a constant grating echo just below them. Leah's voice, higher now, called down. A crack. To your right, he looked. A narrow vertical crevice split the rock face, barely wider than his shoulders. It was a tight, dark slit. It looked like a trap, but it was their only option. He lunged for it, pulling his body into the tight space. Leah was already there, pressed deep inside. The squeeze was immediate and claustrophobic. The rock pressed against his chest wound, sending fresh jolts of pain through him. The leading dagger tooth reached the opening. It snarled, its head filling the gap. It tried to force its way in, but its broad shoulders jammed against the stone. It could not follow. The crevice was too narrow. It was a perfect natural bottleneck. They were safe for now. Trapped but safe. Kyle leaned against the cool rock, breathing hard. Leah was pressed beside him, her small hand finding his. They had done it. Not through superior firepower, but through combined effort. His trust in her knowledge had been absolute. Her trust in his strength had been complete. The climb had proven their bond was not just emotional. It was a practical, tested reality. They had survived because they worked as one unit. Kyle assumed he would be the teacher. He was the one with the technology, the training, the experience on hostile worlds. He handed her a hydration tab to dissolve in water. She took it, examined the small white pellet, then pointed to a gnarled, gray-barked tree with weeping sap. That one gives better water, cleans it. He had marked that tree as potentially toxic. Its sap was acidic to the touch. She showed him how to score the bark at a precise angle, catching the clear fluid that welled up in a hollow leaf. It was cool and free of the metallic tang his reclaimer always left behind. His respect for her began there with water. It grew with fire. He reached for his plasma igniter. She stopped him with a small hand on his wrist. She gathered a handful of dry, papery moss from a rock face and a specific type of brittle twig. She arranged them with quick, practiced movements. Then she took a piece of flint-like stone and a shard of metal she pulled from her small belt pouch. 3 sharp strikes. A spark caught the moss. A flame bloomed. It used no battery power. It required no rare elements. It was a skill born of this world, passed from mother to daughter. She understood the forest in a way he never could. He tracked predators by their prints and broken foliage. She read the forest's mood. She knew the dagger teeth were hunting when the canopy birds fell silent for too long. She could identify a plant that soothed burns by the mottled pattern on its leaves. She pointed out a patch of ground he would have walked over. Rock grubbers sleep here. Their holes twist an ankle. Her knowledge was not theoretical. It was earned through a lifetime of observation and necessity. It was the difference between reading a manual and living the experience. This was no longer a rescue operation. The dynamic shifted completely. It became a partnership. He provided security, the shelter of his reinforced camp, the power of his weapons. She provided the intimate, ground-level intelligence he lacked. His technological edge was formidable, but it had blind spots. Her ancestral knowledge filled every one of them. He began to see the planet not just as a series of threats to manage, but as an ecosystem to understand. The teacher was learning from the student. His initial paternal instinct, the urge to protect a vulnerable child, transformed into a genuine admiration for a capable survivor. Her skills were not childish tricks. They were proven, reliable systems. When she identified a root that could be pounded into a nutritious paste, he added it to their rations. When she demonstrated how to weave a specific vine into a near-invisible snare, he helped her set a perimeter. Their combined knowledge created a new tier of safety. His tech handled the macroscopic threats. Her skills handled the subtle ones. Their survival chances didn't just improve. They multiplied. He had the power to stop a charging beast. She had the knowledge to avoid its territory during mating season. He could purify water on a mass scale. She knew where to find the purest sources. It was a perfect complementary fusion. The hardened survivor and the native guide. The soldier and the scholar of her own world. They were building a new way to live. A synthesis of starfaring technology and planetary wisdom. The line between protector and protected blurred, then vanished. They were simply partners. Two survivors from two different worlds making one stand together. The ghost of the Prime Directive haunted every act of kindness. It was a constant silent weight on Kyle's shoulders. Each piece of food he shared, each word of English he spoke, each demonstration of Earth technology was a violation. He was crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. The rules were clear and absolute for a reason. Introducing advanced concepts to a developing culture could trigger societal collapses. It could create god complexes, dependency, or wars over technology they couldn't understand. His compassion for one individual could theoretically damage an entire civilization. The scale of that potential consequence was immense. It sat in his gut like a cold stone. He would watch Leah eat a ration bar and see a potential ecological shift if she described its wrapping to her people. He would show her how to clean his rifle, and imagine that knowledge filtering back, disrupting the balance of power among the tribes. Every lesson was a seed of contamination. The directive's purpose was to prevent exactly this kind of interference. It demanded non-intervention. It demanded he remain a silent observer, a ghost in the machine of this world. To do otherwise was the greatest sin a scout could commit. His training had branded that into him. Yet the alternative was a different kind of sin. To not help her was to condemn her to death. She was a child. She was alone. She had no tribe, no family, no resources. Leaving her to the mercy of the forest was a death sentence delivered through inaction. It was a clean, bureaucratic solution. Follow the rules and let nature take its course. The ethical trap was perfect. There was no path that didn't lead to a violation of some core principle. He could break interstellar law, or he could break a fundamental human code. He could protect an abstract culture or a concrete life. He struggled with this daily. The weight of the decision was a heavier burden than any pack he had carried. He was a soldier trained to follow orders. Now he was his own commanding officer, and the orders he had to give were impossible. Leah watched him sometimes during these quiet struggles. She saw the distant look in his eyes. One evening she asked a simple question. "Do your people have rules about being alone too?" She wasn't asking about the Prime Directive. She was asking about exclusion. She understood the concept of rules that separated people better than any regulation manual ever could. Her entire life had been governed by the unwritten rules of her tribe that said she did not belong. She knew the crushing weight of being on the wrong side of a principle. Her question cut through the complex ethical arguments. It reduced everything to its human core. She knew what it was like to be rejected for what you are. The Prime Directive was, in its own way, a rule of rejection. It said these people must be kept apart for their own good. It was a well-intentioned exclusion, but exclusion nonetheless. Kyle looked at her, at this child who had been cast out for the crime of existing, and he knew, some principles are meant to be guidelines. They are meant to preserve life, not sacrifice it on an altar of ideological purity. When the unyielding letter of the law conflicts with its spirit, when it demands you abandon a child to die, then the law is wrong. Sometimes basic humanity must come first. The directive's shadow was long, but it could not eclipse a simple act of decency. He made his choice. He would face the consequences later. The sound began as a low thrum, a vibration in the air more than a noise. It was a frequency that didn't belong to Kia. It was a mechanical heartbeat. Kyle was mending a snare with Leah, her small hands threading a sinew cord. He froze, his head came up. Every muscle in his body went tense. He knew that sound. It was buried deep in his memory, a ghost from another life. The forest birds fell silent. The familiar hum of insects ceased. The natural world held its breath. The thrum grew. It built from a whisper to a steady pounding rhythm. It became a thunder that vibrated in his teeth. It was the sound of engines. Earth-made engines. A reconnaissance pattern. He knew the scan and search cadence of a long-range scout ship. It was methodical, covering a grid. They were looking for something. For someone, for him. After 6 years, they had come. The sound represented everything he had wanted for the first 5 of those years. Rescue, home, the end of isolation. It was the hope that had kept him going through the worst nights. It was the dream. Leah dropped the cord. Her hands went to her ears. Her eyes were wide with a fear he hadn't seen since the first day. It wasn't the fear of a predator. It was the fear of the utterly unknown. She had never heard technology on this scale. Her world was the whisper of wind and the cry of animals. This was a shattering industrial roar from the sky itself. It was a sound of pure, overwhelming power. She looked to him for an explanation, for reassurance. Her entire frame was rigid with alarm. He looked at her frightened face, and the dream of rescue curdled in his stomach. This moment, this sound he had prayed for, now felt like a threat. It wasn't salvation. It was an ending. It threatened the delicate, hard-won life they had built together. Their camp, their routines, their quiet partnership. It threatened her. The Prime Directive would descend with that ship. It would demand explanations he could not give. It would see her not as a person, but as a violation, a problem to be solved, a subject to be studied, quarantined, and ultimately separated from the contaminating influence that was him. His choice on that first day, the choice to let her stay, was a choice that could not be undone. It could not be hidden. It was written in the second cot, in the shared meals, in the way she spoke his language. It was written in the trust in her eyes. That sound from the sky was coming to audit that choice. It was coming to enforce the rules he had broken for the sake of a single, lonely child. The consequences were no longer a distant hypothetical. They were descending from the sky in a ship of gleaming metal, bringing with them the full weight of interstellar law. The isolated bubble of their existence was about to be popped. The world he had left behind had finally found him, and it was bringing all its complications with it. The quiet life was over. The shuttle doors opened on a plume of vapor. Commander Ellis stepped out, flanked by 2 junior officers. Her eyes scanned the hybrid camp, taking in the wreckage of Kyle's ship woven together with native materials. Her expression was professional, composed. She expected to find a lone survivor, a man worn thin by years of isolation, a debriefing, a standard extraction. The file on Corporal Kyle was clear. The planet was non-sentient. The mission was recovery. Then her gaze landed on the girl. The girl stood half hidden behind Kyle, one hand gripping the fabric of his patched trousers. Her skin was a pale blue, her features an unsettling blend of human and something else entirely. The sight was a physical jolt. It violated every page of the mission brief. It was the one scenario they never trained for. A hybrid child, a living, breathing violation of the Prime Directive. The air grew thick with unspoken protocol breaches. Her officers shifted their weight, hands drifting toward sidearms. The situation had just left the realm of standard procedure and entered uncharted territory. Kyle stepped forward. He didn't salute. He met the commander's eyes. His explanation was quiet, direct. He spoke of finding her, of her mother's death, of her mixed heritage. He spoke of the bond they had formed. He used the word family. His voice held no apology, only a flat statement of fact. He was not asking for permission. He was informing her of a reality. The child was his responsibility. She was part of his survival. The complication deepened. Ellis understood the implication immediately. This wasn't a case of recent first contact contamination. The child's age, her knowledge of human symbols, her language skills, it all pointed to a prior incident. A corporate scout operating illegally, a man who broke all the rules, fathered a child and then vanished, leaving this mess behind. This was a legacy issue. It was a problem seeded years ago, left to grow in the dark until it bloomed into this impossible moment. The Prime Directive offered no guidance here. It was a blunt instrument designed to prevent initial contact. It never contemplated what to do with the living consequences of a prior hidden violation. The rulebook was useless. Ellis stood at a crossroads. One path was clear, clean, and by the book. Separate them. Quarantine the child for study. Rehabilitate the soldier. Uphold the directive. It was the safe choice. The expected choice. The other path was a minefield. It meant acknowledging their bond. It meant accepting that the directive had already failed here. It meant bending or even breaking regulations to accommodate a human connection that defied all categories. She had to weigh the abstract principle of non-interference against the concrete reality of a terrified child, clinging to the only person who had ever shown her kindness. The right choice wasn't in any manual. It was a judgment call. Leadership in its purest form is not about blindly following rules. It is about interpreting their spirit. It is about understanding that rules serve people, not the other way around. They are a framework for justice, not a substitute for wisdom. Commander Ellis looked from the hardened soldier to the hybrid child. She saw the protective set of his shoulders. She saw the raw fear in her eyes. This was not a contamination event to be contained. It was a family to be considered. The weight of command settled on her, heavier than any armor. She had to make a decision that would define not just their futures, but the very meaning of the laws she was sworn to uphold. Sometimes the right choice isn't the legal one. It's the human one. They had 12 hours. The shuttle sat like a silent promise on the edge of the clearing, its hatch open. The frantic energy of the arrival was gone. A quiet urgency remained. They had a half day to gather what they could not leave behind. Earth was the next destination, a world of billions of cities of rules. Kyle knew it would be as alien to Leah as Kia had been to him. The gravity was different. The air was different. The sheer noise of it all would be a constant assault. He watched her as she carefully packed a small satchel. She included a cutting of the moss that had saved his life, a few smooth river stones, a twisted piece of root her mother had carved. These were her artifacts, her connection to a world she was about to lose. She looked up from her packing. Her large eyes were serious. Will I ever come back here? The question was small, hanging in the air between them. It was not a demand. It was a need to understand the shape of her future, to know if this goodbye was permanent. Kyle did not offer her a comfortable lie. He owed her the truth, no matter how uncertain. He knelt, putting himself at her eye level. I don't know, he said, his voice low. The future is not something we can see. It will be complicated. There will be many people who will have to decide. He did not soften the reality. He gave her the honesty she deserved. Their bond had been forged in the certainty of survival. The next challenges would be formless, bureaucratic. They would face medical examinations, legal hearings, public curiosity. They would be studied, questioned, and likely judged. Prejudice was a predator they had not yet faced. Its attacks would be subtle, its claws made of paper and policy. They could not predict the specific battles ahead. They could only know they would have to fight them, but they would not fight alone. This was the single unshakable fact. We will face it together, he said. It was a simple statement, a renewal of the promise he had made in the forest. They were a team, a unit. The complications of Earth would be just another hostile environment to navigate. Their strategy would remain the same. Combine their strengths, cover each other's weaknesses, trust in the bond that had kept them alive. Some homes are not built from wood and stone. They are not located on a map. A home can be the space between two people who choose to protect each other. It is the safety found in a shared glance, the comfort of a familiar presence in an unfamiliar place. Kyle and Leah were leaving the physical place of their home, but they were taking its foundation with them. They carried it in their trust, their shared history, their mutual resolve. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite it. It is the willingness to build a new world when the old one is gone. They would have to construct a new life from the ground up on a planet that saw her as a specimen, and him as a rule breaker. They would have to build their own small world within the larger, confusing one. The love that forms between beings is not limited by biology or origin. It is a force that operates on its own logic. It can cross the vacuum of space. It can bridge the vast divide between species. It can create a family where none should exist. It is the one tool that can build a home anywhere, even in the most foreign of landscapes. Their future was a blank page, a silent frontier. But they would write it together, one difficult, courageous day at a time. The universe is built on rules of separation. Stars hold their distance. Worlds spin alone. But courage sometimes chooses a different path. It picks connection over isolation. Compassion can reshape our deepest duties. It can bend the strictest codes. Family is not a matter of blood or species. It is a choice to stand together. An oath made in the silence between heartbeats. When the rule book demands you turn away from a soul in need, which do you choose? The clean line of the law or the messy truth of a helping hand? Kyle didn't plead. He reasoned. He stood his ground, Leah a silent presence behind him. He looked past the rigid protocols, past the standard extraction playbook. He went for the part of the regulations most officers never opened. Discretionary authority. He proposed a specific obscure clause. Special Directive 994. It was a piece of interstellar law so rarely invoked it was nearly forgotten. It wasn't designed for first contact scenarios. It was a humanitarian measure, a legal tool for extraordinary circumstances. It allowed for the evacuation of individuals from non-Federation worlds under imminent threat of genocide or cultural eradication. It was a loophole for life-saving intervention when the normal rules would demand inaction. The tension in the air sharpened. Ellis knew the directive. Every commander did. It was the exception that proved the rule. It acknowledged that sometimes the strictest laws could cause the greatest harm if applied without nuance. Kyle was arguing that Leah's situation, while unique, fit the spirit of the law. Her mixed heritage made her a target. She was actively persecuted by her own people for what she was. She and her mother had been living in exile, under constant threat because of her human bloodline. Her mother was already dead because of it. That constituted a clear and present danger. She wasn't just a scientific subject to be observed. She was a dependent, a child under the protection of a Federation citizen. His protection. Ellis turned the proposition over in her mind. The decision was monumental. Applying Special Directive 994 here would be a radical interpretation. It was meant for large-scale ethnic cleansings, not individual cases. It would mean officially classifying a hybrid child as a person worthy of Federation protection, effectively granting her a status no one like her had ever held. This wasn't just about Kyle and Leah. It was about precedent. It would set a legal marker. It would tell every deep space scout and commander that in the gray areas, compassion had a pathway. It would acknowledge that reality sometimes outpaces regulation, that some situations are too human for the rulebook. The directive was a door. Ellis held the key. She could choose the clean, by-the-book solution. Separate them. Study her. It was the safe, expected path. Or she could choose to see the directive not as a rigid text, but as a living document. She could interpret its purpose to save lives over its precise technical wording. She could acknowledge that the law, in its wisdom, had built this very escape hatch for moments when humanity and bureaucracy collided. Sometimes laws need to bend. Not break, but bend. They need to accommodate the messy, complicated reality of people's lives. A good system isn't one that is blindly followed. It is one that can be wisely applied. Compassion can find its way through the most convoluted, bureaucratic maze if someone is willing to look for the path. It requires a commander to see a person, not a problem. To see a family, not a contamination event. The law provided the tools. It was up to her to decide which one to use. The hammer of strict enforcement or the scalpel of discretionary mercy. The right tool for the right job. She looked from the weathered soldier, standing protectively, to the frightened child beside him. She saw their bond. It was real. It was the foundation of their survival. The law was supposed to serve and protect life. Sometimes that life came in an unexpected form. Her decision would determine if the system could accommodate that reality, or if it would crush it under the weight of its own rules. Commander Ellis stood silent. Her gaze moved from Kyle's resolute face to the child half hidden behind him. Her blue fingers knotted in his worn trouser leg. The air in the clearing felt heavy, charged with the weight of the impending decision. It was not a small thing she was considering. This was not just about one soldier and one alien child. It was about precedent. It was about the very fabric of interstellar law. Her choice here would ripple outward, affecting future contact scenarios, legal interpretations, and the lives of anyone who might find themselves in the gray space between regulation and reality. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the idling shuttle and the distant calls of Kia's forest. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, measured, carrying the full authority of her rank. Yes. The single word landed with the force of a verdict. She looked directly at Leah, then back to Kyle. There will be challenges ahead. Significant ones. Legal, social, medical. But you won't be separated without compelling cause. The words were carefully chosen. They were not a blanket approval. They were a qualified acceptance. They acknowledged the legitimacy of their bond while recognizing the difficult road that lay before them. It was an official validation. Her statement confirmed that their relationship forged in survival held weight. It was not a mistake to be corrected. It was a fact to be managed. She was committing her command to finding a way. Legal pathways would be sought. Precedents would be examined. Bureaucratic hurdles would be navigated. The immense machine of interstellar governance would be tasked with accommodating this unique, unforeseen circumstance. It was a promise to try, to bend the system to fit the people, rather than break the people to fit the system. The core principle was clear. The rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. Regulations were a framework for order and protection, but they were not infallible. They could not anticipate every scenario. When they failed to account for basic human decency, for the profound connection between two beings, then the system itself had to adapt. Commander Ellis was choosing adaptation over rigid enforcement. She was interpreting the spirit of the law, which was ultimately about preserving life and dignity, over its strictest letter. Their future would be complex. Earth would be an alien world to Leah. There would be tests, debates, and scrutiny. They would face curiosity and likely prejudice. Their every move would be analyzed. But they would face it together. The threat of being torn apart, the fear that had lived with them since the shuttle's descent, was lifted. The battle would now shift to courtrooms and committee hearings instead of forest clearings. It was a trade they would make. The complications of bureaucracy were a price worth paying for the certainty of each other's presence. Some bonds are simply worth the fight. They are worth the paperwork, the debates, the challenges. The connection between Kyle and Leah was one of them. It was not a casual thing. It was built on shared loss, mutual survival, and proven loyalty. It had been tested by claw and tooth and the crushing weight of isolation. A bond that strong can withstand the weight of any bureaucracy. It can redefine the meaning of family, of duty, and of law itself. Commander Ellis saw that truth. Her decision honored it. She gave them not just permission, but a fighting chance.